Emily and Jake had been looking forward to their mountain getaway for months. Nestled deep in the woods, the cabin promised solitude, fresh air, and a break from their hectic city lives. As they drove up the winding path, the air grew cooler, and the dense forest around them seemed to swallow the sunlight. "This is perfect," Emily said, leaning out the window to breathe in the pine-scented air. Jake grinned. A whole week of peace and quiet. The cabin was quaint, with rustic wooden walls and a small porch overlooking a sparkling lake. Inside, it was cozy, with a stone fireplace and a big, comfy bed. They unpacked quickly, eager to start their vacation. The first few days were idyllic. They hiked through the woods, canoed on the lake, and spent their evenings by the fire, talking and laughing. On the fourth day, however, things began to change. It started with a storm. The sky darkened suddenly, and thunder rumbled in the distance. They hurried inside just as the rain began to pour, lashing against the windows with an intensity that made it seem like the cabin might be swept away. "Guess we're stuck inside today," Jake said, throwing another log on the fire. Emily shrugged. "We can read, play some games. It'll be fun." As the storm raged outside, they played cards and told stories. But as night fell, the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. They lit candles and huddled together, trying to ignore the eerie howls of the wind and the creaking of the trees. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. They froze, staring at each other. "Who could that be?" Emily whispered, her heart pounding. Jake grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" A man's voice answered, strained and desperate. "Please help me. I'm lost and my car broke down." Jake glanced at Emily, who nodded. He opened the door to reveal a man in his 50s, drenched and shivering. His eyes darted around nervously. "Thank you," he gasped, stepping inside. "I'm Dr. Richard Harlow. My car broke down a few miles back, and I got turned around in the storm." Emily fetched a towel and a blanket, while Jake poured the man a cup of coffee. Dr. Harlow sat by the fire, his hands trembling as he wrapped the blanket around himself. "Thank you so much," he repeated. "I was sure I was going to freeze to death out there." As they talked, Emily and Jake learned that Dr. Harlow was a scientist who had been working in a nearby lab. He was vague about his research, saying only that it was highly sensitive. The storm showed no signs of letting up, so they offered him a place to sleep on the couch. That night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about their guest. She tossed and turned, finally drifting into a restless sleep. She woke to a noise in the middle of the night. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard it again. A faint clinking sound, like metal on metal. She nudged Jake awake. "Jake, do you hear that?" He listened, then nodded, his expression serious. "Stay here." Jake grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed out of the bedroom. Emily followed, despite his protest. The noise led them to the kitchen, where they found Dr. Harlow rummaging through their drawers. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded. Dr. Harlow jumped, dropping a knife he had been holding. I was just looking for something to eat. Couldn't sleep." Jake frowned but nodded. "All right, but please don't sneak around. Just ask if you need something." Dr. Harlow apologized profusely and retreated to the couch. They went back to bed, but sleep eluded them both. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Dr. Harlow thanked them again and said he would hike back to his car. He insisted he could manage alone, despite their offers to help. After he left, Emily and Jake decided to explore the area he had mentioned, curious about the lab. They packed a lunch and set off through the woods. After a couple of hours, they stumbled upon a dilapidated building, half hidden by the trees. It looked abandoned, but they could see faint lights inside. "Should we check it out?" Emily asked, her curiosity piqued. Jake hesitated. "I don't know. Something about this feels wrong." But Emily was already moving forward. They crept up to a window and peered inside. What they saw made their blood run cold. The room was filled with cages, each containing small animals. Strange machines buzzed and whirred, and the air smelled of chemicals. In the center of the room stood Dr. Harlow, his back to them. He was hunched over a table, working on something they couldn't see. "What's he doing?" Jake whispered. Before Emily could respond, Dr. Harlow turned. In his hand was a syringe filled with a glowing green liquid. He moved to one of the cages and injected a rabbit, which immediately began to convulse. Emily gasped, and Dr. Harlow's head snapped up. Their eyes met, and his expression twisted into one of fury. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. They tore through the woods, branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, they heard Dr. Harlow shouting, his footsteps pounding after them. The forest seemed to close in, but they didn't dare slow down. They burst out of the trees and into the clearing around their cabin. Jake fumbled with the keys, throwing the door open just as Dr. Harlow appeared at the edge of the woods. "Get inside!" Jake yelled. They slammed the door and locked it, then shoved furniture against it for good measure. Dr. Harlow's furious pounding echoed through the cabin. "You can't hide from me," he screamed. "You're mine now." Emily and Jake huddled together, trembling. "What do we do?" Emily whispered. Jake's eyes were fierce. "We fight." They grabbed kitchen knives and waited. The pounding grew louder, then stopped. Silence. Then a crash as a window shattered. Dr. Harlow was inside. Jake charged, and the two men grappled, knocking over furniture. Emily lunged, slashing at Dr. Harlow, who howled in pain. Together, they overpowered him, tying him up with whatever they could find. "We have to get out of here," Jake panted. "Now!" They grabbed their bags and ran to their car. As they sped down the mountain, Emily looked back to see Dr. Harlow struggling against his bonds, his eyes wild with rage. They drove straight to the nearest town and called the police. When they returned with authorities, the lab was empty. No animals, no machines, no trace of Dr. Harlow. He had vanished, leaving only their nightmares as evidence of their horrifying encounter.